Welcome to presentation number 6 in our series, Retrieving Romans. Today we are going to retrieve what is wrong and what God did to set it right. And it might seem pretentious or presumptuous even to make these to make these assertions. Do we need to retrieve that? Don't we know what is wrong? Don't we already know what God did to set it right? Well, let's see. So already at the beginning of our approach to Romans, at the beginning of the letter, we have said that there is a fork in the road. This is the traditional road, the traditional way of reading Romans. This is the Lutheran lens, you might say. There's a problem. How can I be saved? And there is an answer to that. It's the message of justification by faith. But we heard the voice of Habakkuk earlier in the Old Testament, echoing at the beginning of the letter. And Habakkuk wonders about God's absence. What is God doing in the world? The absent, can God be trusted? Is the way Richard Hayes has put it. And the answer to that is not justification by faith simply. We need some kind of revelation to answer the question whether God can be trusted. So, which road are we on here in this fork in the road? And yes, we have taken the road to the right, and I will say the right road. So we saw some strange pivots here to bring this out at the beginning of the letter. First, hearing the voice of Habakkuk, the problem of God's absence. And then a pivot, a sort of change of scenery to God's anger, God's wrath. And then we heard Paul as a kind of rebuking voice, speaking back to the voice speaking here, as a kind of rebuke, a pushback, as it were. And our task has been to preserve the force of that pushback, because it is so easily lost. And I read commentaries and studies of Paul, and that pushback is muted. It is quite harsh. So to do justice to that pushback, we saw this speaker switching, prosopopoeia, we called it, changing of faces, as it were. And we wonder, is it a teaching technique? It is happening. Is it a teaching technique in the hands of a clever pedagogue, Paul? Or is it, as we concluded, speech and character confronting real people that threaten Paul's mission? And I have opted for the second explanation as a much stronger candidate. Moving on. The voices never go away. There will be a sort of back and forth, give and take. It is not as though the voice we hear at the beginning in this rather shrill passage in 1:18 to 32, that it disappears, but it gets muted. So here, this is the voice number 2, and this is the more compassionate, more softer voice number 1. And we heard this voice in a rather angry way saying they were filled with every kind of wickedness, senseless, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Well, maybe they were. But then in this more compassionate voice, you might say, this more solemn voice, not shrill, but solemn. You hear someone say, I think it is Paul, when Gentiles who do not possess the law do instinctively what the law requires. These, though not having the law, are a law to themselves. So in some ways, the second voice here rehabilitates the bad impression made of the reality described here. It is a pushback. And then we hear the second voice say, circumcision indeed is of value if you obey the law. But if you break the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. Suddenly we're talking about circumcision. Where did that come from? Well, it comes here from voice number 2, from the counter-missionary emphasis. It's there. It is the premise. It is the assumption. It is what is the part of the iceberg that is below sea level, as it were, the narrative assumption of the entire letter. So these voices continue. We won't fill all the gaps here. We are skipping ahead a bit. We are now in chapter 3, verse 9, and we hear the solemn voice speaking. What then? Are we any better? No, not at all, for we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin. That's a strange term. So just to say a couple of things about it. Sin, hamartia, as misperception of God. Sin as misperception of good. This one is theological. This one is ethical. Sin as incapacity. Even if a person has the right conception of God and good, this would be anthropology. You know what is right. You know what is good. It doesn't come together. And Paul will say much more about that later in the letter. And then we get into territory where Paul makes an argument and he helps himself copiously to Old Testament passages. Let's see what he says. What is wrong? Number 1, there is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who has understanding. There is no one who seeks God. And you can get as much from my illustration here if you can imagine whose hands those are, and this person running away, he is not seeking God. Maybe it is the other way around. And then here, using an illustration from William Blake's paintings of the book of Job, this is the Ancient of Days. It is as though God is speaking. It is as though the Old Testament voice that we hear is the voice of God. Surely there is no one righteous on earth who will do good and will not ever sin. And we see how Paul has used that text in his letter to the Romans. Fools say in their hearts, there is no God. They are corrupt. They commit abominable acts. There is no one who does good. God looks down from heaven on humankind to see if there are any who are wise, who seek after God. And the answer is, as illustrated, that this is how the human condition looks. And we see the close correlation between Romans and Old Testament texts. Still on what is wrong, number 1. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. There is no one who shows kindness. There is not even one. And we have a fork in the road. There is a good choice, a bad choice. And guess which one wins out? And the voice from on high speaks again in an authoritative way, as though there is no contrary point of view that has any chance of succeeding. That's how this voice speaks. They have all fallen away. They are all alike perverse. There is no one who does good. No, not a single one. And then we switch to what is wrong, number 2. There is a progression, a sequence as it were, and let's see what happens. Their throats are opened graves. They use their tongues to deceive. Now we are in the territory of speech. Really bad, toxic, death-oriented speech, as it were. And the metaphor is really striking. Speech that leads to the grave, that leads to death and destruction. And our voice from on high again. There is nothing reliable in what they say. Their inward part is futility itself, or destruction itself. Their throat is an open grave. They flatter with their tongue. And still on the same line, the venom of vipers is under their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. And the voice from on high, just the same. His mouth is full of curses and deceit and oppression. Under his tongue is mischief and wickedness. They make their tongue sharp as a snake's, and under their lips is the venom of vipers. And these are extremely strong metaphors. Aside from a biblical story, it would still be bad speech, really bad. But when you bring in the serpent and poison, you have to think about Genesis. You have to think about the misrepresentation of God at the beginning of the biblical narrative. You have to think in rather strong ways about not just untrue ways, but in some ways just ruining language, ruining the meaning of words, disinformation, misinformation, misrepresentation, misleading, fake news, a whole panorama of speech that creates confusion and is the instrument of number 3. What is wrong, number 3? Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery are in their paths, and the way of peace they have not known. And here are feet rushing to shed blood, as it were. And we have the voice from on high doing us, or backing this up. Their feet run to evil, and they rush to shed innocent blood. Their thoughts are thoughts of iniquity. Desolation and destruction are in their highways. The way of peace they do not know. And there is no justice in their paths. Their roads they have made crooked. No one who walks in them knows peace. So here we have it, and there is a conclusion here at the end that in some ways goes back to 3:10, what we heard first. There is no one who seeks God. Here again, there is no fear of God before their eyes, and this person is brazenly throwing fear over the cliff, as it were. And our voice from on high, transgression speaks to the wicked deep in their hearts. There is no fear of God before their eyes. So, just compressing this and summarizing it, reviewing it, now again to preserve the sequence, the 1, 2, 3 feel of it. Fools say in their hearts, there is no God. Well, how should we see that? Are they atheists? Are they denying the existence of God? Hardly. That is a new thing, a new sort of philosophical novelty in following the Enlightenment and our time, the age of reason. In the old days, there were no outright deniers of God's existence. So listen to what these scholars say about the text we have quoted from Psalms. The foolishness of the fool is described under a twofold mutually conditioned aspect. On the one hand, he has a false view of the world and does not recognize the order of righteousness placed within it by the Creator. This wrong idea of the world is expressed in false thinking about God, not exactly denying the existence of God, but not thinking aright about God. And so you cannot say about Jews in the ancient world that they deny the existence of God. You can't even say that about the Gentile world. But you can say that in these faith communities there is false thinking about God. That works. And so, which the Psalm summarizes in a single quotation, God is not there. So here it is, number one, false thinking about God. And then number two, they make their tongue sharp as a snake's, and under their lips is the venom of vipers. We saw that as speech. And so number two, in our attempt to retrieve what is wrong, is false speech, debasement of language, Orwellian language, as it were, that we have learned, a term we have in our time. And then as number three, their feet are swift to shed blood, ruin and misery are in their paths, and the way of peace they have not known. And yes, there is a progression here. There is a pattern. There is a kind of sequence. The third one, false action, and the action is violence. Let me put it in these terms here. False thinking about God, number one. Debasement of language, number two. And violence, number three. So, are these individual sins? Because Romans 3 is often read quite piously as, my sins are not really good. There's no one who is good. There is not even one. And so you look around in our neighborhoods and you say, does this describe me, my neighbor, my wife, my children? It takes a little more here than just thinking about these things in individual terms. Here, this is better read as a societal representation of sin than as a representation of individual sin, even though it is true that those who act in this way do so always as individuals. That doesn't cease. That doesn't go away. But at the same time, they do so as part of a collective, structural evil power. So here we are, in this together. And the representation of sin here that we are looking to retrieve is really more a societal representation. Let me ask this question. If you think this was evil, this is the bomb at Hiroshima, who committed this sin? It was pretty severe blast. It just let everything waste. Who committed it? Was it the pilot who flew the plane? Was it the ones who built the bomb? Was it the priest who prayed for the pilot who flew the plane? Because a priest did in fact pray for him. So if you think there is ownership, a sort of trend in society, a way of thinking about how to solve problems that eventually led us to the atomic bomb and eventually led us to conditions in the world today where we are kept safe by atomic bombs, by the threat of that. It's a big thing. That's societal sin. Who owns this one? So this is one that I had commissioned, and Jared Wright is the person who made it for me, but it is the arrival platform here at Birkenau. So was it Nazis, Germans? What sort of participation, what sort of buy-in should we have? And many people have said after the Holocaust that this is a human phenomenon, not just German. It is closer. It cuts closer to us than we might like. Here I am in Germany, and this is my own picture of Martin Luther in front of the recently rebuilt Marienkirche that was totally destroyed when Dresden was bombed toward the end of the war. And here is Luther with his Bible, but it's not all comfortable, and I have referenced this a little bit earlier in one earlier talk. He says in 1543, "What shall we Christians do with this rejected and condemned people, the Jews?" And then he recommends 7 things. First, to set fire to their synagogues. Second, I advise that their houses also be razed and destroyed. Third, I advise that all their prayer books be taken from them. Fourth, I advise that their rabbis be forbidden to teach. Fifth, I advise that safe conduct on the highways be abolished completely for the Jews. Sixth, I advise that usury be prohibited to them, and that all cash and treasure of silver and gold be taken from them. Seventh, I recommend letting them earn their bread in the sweat of their brow, taking them back to slavery. So what is this? Well, sadly, but clearly it bears some relation, not that Luther foresaw what would happen, but here I am in Marburg, in the city where the oldest Protestant university in the world is founded in 1527. And the university is just down the street here, 100 meters away. Actually, Luther and Zwingli met in this town once. And here is what used to be the synagogue that had recently been rebuilt and remodeled in Marburg. It was burned to the ground. First, to set fire to their synagogues. Well, they did. It was burned to the ground on November 10, 1938. Luther's birthday, and this is a memorial plaque here. And so even here, in the person who understands in some ways the letter to the Romans, and to whom we owe something, I won't deny that, but we hear false thinking about God. We hear serious debasement of language, and we see no deterrent to violence, quite the opposite. So there is a reason for thinking that we do need to have another path when we read this letter. And let's go on. I jumped ahead of myself here. I just wanted to see the societal part, the sort of broad ownership of the panorama of what is wrong according to the letter to the Romans. Now I'm going back to the 1st century, to Paul's time. And this is how things looked in ancient Israel. 150 years or so before the birth of the Apostle Paul and Jesus, who were contemporaries, there was a Jewish liberation movement under the leadership of Judas Maccabeus. They're called the Maccabeans, or the Hasmoneans. And they started a war of liberation against the Greek rulers. And this is Rubens, the artist Rubens, around 1600, painting Judas Maccabeus as a military conqueror. And when you read the book of Maccabees, it's almost like reading, I hardly dare to say it, it's like reading maybe something similar to ISIS. It's very severe, very cruel. And here I read just one little passage. He showed them the vile Nicanor's head. He is the leader of the Greek army. They have beheaded him and they have cut off his arm. He showed them the vile Nicanor's head, and that profane man's arm, which had been boastfully stretched out against the holy house of the Almighty. He cut out the tongue of the ungodly Nicanor and said that he would feed it piecemeal to the birds, and would hang up these rewards, the head and the arm and the tongue, these rewards of his folly opposite the sanctuary. And they all, looking to heaven, blessed the Lord who had manifested himself, saying, "Blessed is he who has kept his own place undefiled." And I ask, is this correct thinking about God? Language and the theological sanction of violence. That's what we have. Here is the Roman Empire, the secular Roman Empire at the time of Paul. And there is a myth, a theological myth here at the heart of the empire, where the language is exactly the language in Romans. Good news, euangelion, Lord, Kyrios, Son of God, Savior, soter, salvation, soteria, faithfulness, pistis, righteousness, diakosine, peace and wrath, orge, all of these words claimed by the empire. And here is the altar of peace that Augustus had built about 30 years before Paul wrote his letter to the Romans. It's all an image of salvation, peace, prosperity, all is good. And then you can have, here is a close-up, by the way, from a scene, a depiction on the altar here. It's all fertility, prosperity, and peace. That's what the myth projects. But the reality is a little different. It is prosperity founded on oppression, on slavery. And the fate of the slave often was crucifixion. So the reality of slavery, educated people in the Roman Empire, the writers, the intellectuals, they don't go there. They leave it unmentioned. They leave it out because reality would destroy the myth. And then it's Pax Romana. But it is peace founded on conquest and violence. And Tacitus, the Roman historian, he says, true, there was peace. Bloody peace is what he says. And here, just to bring this home, this is not from Roman times. This is a tire store somewhere on the corner in your neighborhood, wherever, or in my neighborhood. And this is what we should think of. So, like tire stores, there were in Rome private crucifixion services, private businesses catering to patrons, rich patrons who might just want to see their slave crucified for some trivial offense that the slave had committed. This is reality. This is where the writers are cringing around the void, because there is a death-driven reality here that they don't want to talk about. So, leaving the Roman Empire behind and jumping ahead for a couple of examples in more recent history, we are now in the Christian Roman Empire. We are in the 4th century at the beginning, as the Emperor Constantine becomes a Christian, and the sort of political impact of Christianity is felt now on the empire, and vice versa. So this is Raphael, or the school of Raphael, and their depiction of a scene ahead of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD. Here is the emperor, and here he has a vision. And the vision here is a vision of the cross. And there is a message written in Greek here, and toto nika in Greek. In Latin, it's better known in hoc signo vinces. By this sign you shall win. And so from here on, there is language, there is thinking about God, where this scenario of God and empire, religion and empire, are now blended. And there is language And the church historian of Constantine's time, Eusebius, he just can't praise enough how wonderful this is that you now have military and political support for promoting Christianity. And yes, you will have violence. Now, jumping much further down to the 20th century, here we are in what someone has said was the most Christian war ever fought, the First World War. And the speaker here is the Bishop of London. His name was Arthur Winnington Ingraham. He was giving a sermon during World War I, the war that was fought in the trenches with 10 million or so dead. So this is what he says in his sermon. But when we have said all that, this is a holy war. We are on the side of Christianity against Antichrist. We are on the side of the New Testament, which respects the weak and honors treaties and dies for its friends and looks upon war as a regrettable necessity. It is a holy war, and to fight a holy war is an honor. Is it a holy war? Is this true? Or is it false thinking about God from the pulpit and language leading to the violence that we have here? Later he gives this sermon, same thing. The church offering itself as a propagandist for the empire or for war. Kill Germans, kill them. Not for the sake of killing, but to save the world. Kill the good as well as the bad. Kill the young as well as the old. Kill those who have shown kindness to our wounded as well as those fiends who crucified the Canadian sergeant. I look upon it as a war for purity. I look upon everyone who dies in it as a martyr, and we get the point. So this is why it seems to me quite justified to bill our reading of Romans as a retrieval, because these perspectives have been muted or lost, and we see them in these societal manifestations: false thinking about God, debasement of language, and violence. And I would have liked to use an example from our time, from America today, but I decided to leave that out. Instead, I will read a page or a passage from my commentary. What many believers see as the way to make things right is actually an account of what is wrong. What is held to be salvation is not salvation, but sin. These societal sins leading to violence, and seeing it in the ancient world and in the Christian world today. In both camps, and thus for human reality in general, there is a God deficit, best described as false thinking about God, a deficit with regard to truth-telling, debasement of language, and a peace deficit, sufficient to silence every mouth and make the whole world accountable to God. And now, moving forward in our text, retrieving what God did to set it right. This is our text first, beginning in Romans 3:21. But now, apart from law, the right making of God has been revealed, attested by the law and by the prophets. The right making of God through the faithfulness of Jesus Christ to all who believe. And you will notice that there are some distinctives in the way I have translated that text. By the way, I'm not the only one to translate it this way, but it's still not a majority view. So here, for righteousness, right making of God as a dynamic conception and not simply a legal conception. And then pistis Jesu Christu, faithfulness of Jesus Christ, rather than just human faith in Jesus Christ. And the third one, remember Habakkuk. Habakkuk, this is for the word revealed. Habakkuk said that something would be revealed. And it was. The faithfulness of Jesus Christ. That is what it means. And then we read on what God did to set it right. For there is no difference. For all have missed the mark in so many ways. All have missed the mark. Or sinned and lack the right view of the glory of God. They have been set right freely by His grace through the liberating act in Christ Jesus. God set Him forth publicly as a means of reconciliation through the faithfulness of His bloody death. And here is someone shooting target practice and missing the mark. False thinking about God, false speech, and action, violent action, sometimes violent action to fix all the problems we have inflicted on ourselves, war, and that part of the human condition, and the contrast and the faithfulness of His bloody death. And two more verses. He did this in order to demonstrate His right-making in view of the fact that He had passed over the sins previously committed in the forbearance of God. Habakkuk again, why aren't you doing something, God? And here God does something, and we have it here. Remember Habakkuk, God seemed not to be righteous. God seemed not to set things right. God seemed to wink at evil. And then God promised a demonstration, and God delivered. And the last verse, that is, in order to demonstrate His way of setting the world right at the present time, that He, God, may be right in the very act of setting right the one who lives by the faithfulness of Jesus. His way of setting the world right, in contrast to the violent way envisioned by all the world's religions, including Judaism, including Christianity. And setting right then, the right way, it matters how you do it. And that was sorely missing in Luther's outrageous outburst against the Jews. And then to live by the faithfulness of Jesus, to adopt that as an orientation. So in these two panels, summarizing what God did to set it right, first by revelation, for in the gospel, the right making of God is revealed. Something is made visible, something happens, something is seen. And here again, in 3:22, the righteousness of God has been revealed. And the vocabulary of revelation here as apocalypto, and here is as phanero. And demonstration, same idea, to demonstrate His righteousness twice in these passages. And that was what we call it, and this is what it is. By the faithfulness of Jesus Christ, 3:22, the faithfulness of His bloody death. And here the faithfulness of Jesus in 3:26, how the close correspondence here, the sort of mutually explanatory relationship of these terms. We're almost done. I wish to step aside for a little bit of a perspective. There is today a notion of Paul within Judaism. Can you, within the paradigm of Paul within Judaism, explain how he moved from being a persecutor to a proclaimer? Why did he persecute? And how did he change to become a proclaimer of the faith that he once tried to destroy? So I think Paul within Judaism gives a rather weak explanation for that. that there were some practices he did not approve of. That seems too weak. Then you have the new perspective on Paul that says that, that's quite related to Paul within Judaism, that says that Paul, that there is an issue about circumcision, about certain practices again, that you approve or disapprove of, and that should then explain why he was a persecutor and then becomes a proclaimer. Seems to me quite weak. And then we have the old perspective on Paul. That's the Lutheran perspective, where we say that Paul once, or Judaism, was a religion of works. But now you have a new religion, a religion of faith, not works anymore. The path to salvation is not works, but it is faith. And Paul has now moved, he persecuted and became a proclaimer because he moved from a paradigm of works to a paradigm of faith. But here's a problem. The new perspective on Paul has said that this part of the old perspective simply isn't true. Paul believed in grace as a Jewish believer in God. So the works and grace issue simply isn't a good explanation either. So what is a good explanation? This is a good explanation. The apocalyptic perspective, the revelation that something happens. And here is Caravaggio's depiction of Paul on the way to Damascus, and with his vision and looking, and it's all a sort of wrenching experience. Something happens, he did not expect it. It was just, it blew open all the old paradigms, as it were. And I want to read this statement by a contemporary scholar and try to make a little sense of it. Remember what I said about that store on the corner in Rome, where you could bring your slave and have him crucified in the morning for $5 or $10. Let's see now the meaning of Christ in that relation. The message that the Christ had shared the fate of a piece of human garbage, one of those whom life had demolished, and who had touched bottom, the Roman slave. This message was a power capable of rescuing those who trusted in it from the despair over the nothingness of their lives, so that even if they lived in the shadow of the cross and died a bit every day, and even if the cross should be their tomb, as it was of their fathers and grandfathers, its power over them was broken and undone, so that they could live on with value and meaning and love and hope, because the one who had died in this contemptible way was the anointed one of God. This is a big step. This is not a whole horizon for the meaning of the apocalyptic perspective on why Paul moves from persecutor to proclaimer, but it is a point. And it is also a point why he emphasizes the death of Jesus and not simply the resurrection of Jesus. For the slave, with his prospect of ending up crucified, to discover that the anointed one of God was crucified was also in the same sort of reality. That is a shocking thing to discover. And this is one side of what I call the apocalyptic perspective. Well, let me try to take this home. And yes, we are not taking it completely home. Maybe not ever, but we move in a certain direction. So here first is Luther with the emphasis on justification. Although justification or righteousness by faith is the most influential reading of Romans, it does fall short of the message of Paul. There is another way, and that other way that begins in Habakkuk is a stronger reading. And here, replacing Luther with Albert Schweitzer and his very influential book on Paul 100 years ago, he says, no, the main thing is not justification. Main thing in Paul is participation. It's being in Christ. And that is a message in Romans. But it is not the full story of what is wrong or of what God did to set it right. And then, without a picture for now, revelation. Justification, participation, and now revelation. The revelation of the right-making of God through the faithfulness of Jesus Christ. Although this emphasis had been neglected or ignored or left out, it tells the story of what is wrong and what God did to set it right. I have an illustration. Before I give it, I want to say one more thing about Habakkuk. Habakkuk says that God seems to be absent. It's a big problem for faith, that problem of the absent God. But then God promises him, I will show you how I am present. And yes, the problem of God's absence is baffling to the mind. But the problem of what God does when he shows himself to be present is more baffling.